Today, China is in the middle of the economic development process. A mere 30 years ago, almost everybody in China was poor, working in agriculture and living in villages. About 50 years ago, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, China's urban areas support a middle class that is growing very quickly. Its industries have grown strikingly. Cities have blossomed where there were once only fields and rice paddies. But China is a big country. Not everyone has grown rich and secure during past decades. Less than half of China's population lives in cities or towns. Most people are still born and live in the same farming villages that their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were born in. Tens of millions of people in China are still very poor. The prosperous areas of China are concentrated in eastern coastal areas. Most of the country, however, is composed of mountains, deserts, and high-altitude plains. Over the centuries, population pressures have forced families into almost every habitable corner of these areas. As a result, villages in China's poor regions tend to be spread out across sprawling, low-quality lands that are remote from cities and are poorly connected by roads and lines of communication. Life in poor regions of rural China remains very difficult. People in these areas are mostly engaged in small-scale farming and raising of livestock. Even if family members work hard, they can barely produce enough to survive on. Farming tasks are undertaken by hand and with oxen, donkeys, and other beasts of burden. The workday typically lasts from sunrise to sundown. People live in simple homes of brick, stone, or mud. It is difficult for many families to earn enough income to acquire adequate food and clothing for their families. The elderly work until overcome with infirmities. These communities remain vulnerable to a large number of uncontrollable events, such as disease, economic shock, and natural disasters. Many areas of China are still poor today because they are not suitable for modern economic growth. These areas are too remote, too difficult to access, or too lacking in resources. From the perspective of government, extending expensive infrastructure and high-quality services like highways and hospitals across all these areas is simply not worth the high costs. What can people who live in these areas do to achieve a higher quality of life? In many cases, the answer is simple. They will have to leave. Throughout history, this is a story that has repeated itself around the world. The rural Irish moved out of the peat bogs of Ireland, the Italians from the rugged mountains of Sicily, the Mexicans from the poverty of southern Mexico. It is likely that the people loved their homeland, but leaving was their only option. Today, as opportunities to work in the factories and businesses of China's growing cities have emerged, more and more rural people have also chosen to leave their ancestral villages behind. Typically, those that leave are young and have at least some education. As a result, in today's remote rural areas, it is sometimes difficult to find many young, working-age individuals. It is an increasingly common sight in rural China to see villages with many abandoned homes where entire families have moved away. What is the best way to eliminate the poverty that persists in China? The rural poor have little capital or wealth. The only asset that they really have is their labor. Providing quality education and healthcare in poor areas is often said to increase human capital, or, in other words, improve the quality of a person so that they are worth more in labor markets and can get a job off the farm and earn a higher wage. That is why education is so important in poor areas. Unfortunately, access to quality education is still a problem in poor regions of China. In the countryside, schools have few facilities and good teachers are in short supply. The costs of sending children to school are still higher than many families can afford, and many children drop out as a result. A few decades ago, The vast majority of China's citizens lived in grinding poverty. Over the past 30 years or so, China has made impressive strides in improving the lives of these people. But eliminating poverty in China is still an enormous task that is far from complete. Addressing the chronic shortcomings in China's rural schools is critical for allowing more Chinese to participate in and benefit from the country's growth and avoid the instability that can result from a country that has many poor.